Imagine waking up in a city where 70% of the population is drunk before breakfast, where infants are given alcohol instead of milk because the water will kill them faster, where the government desperately tries to stop an addiction crisis but only makes it worse, where entire neighborhoods are named after the substance destroying them. This isn't science fiction. This isn't exaggeration. This was London in the 1720s, and it was called the gin craze. But here's what makes this story terrifying and relevant. This wasn't about personal weakness or moral failure. This was about a perfect storm of economic desperation, government incompetence, corporate greed, and a population with absolutely no other options. Sound familiar? Before we dive into one of history's most catastrophic addiction epidemics and what it teaches us about modern society, hit that like button if you're ready to understand how an entire civilization nearly drank itself to death. Subscribe if you want to learn the patterns that repeat throughout history. And comment telling me, what modern crisis do you think mirrors the gin epidemic most closely? Opioids, social media, something else? Because for the next 70 minutes, we're going deep into the psychology, economics, and sociology of mass addiction. We're going to understand how rational people make irrational choices when their options are limited, how governments inadvertently fuel the crises they're trying to stop, and most importantly, how societies can recover from the seemingly impossible. This isn't just history. This is a case study in human behavior under pressure that has urgent lessons for today. Get comfortable. Turn off distractions. Because the story of gin-soaked London is really the story of what happens when an entire society reaches its breaking point and chooses slow poison over immediate suffering. Part 1. The Perfect Storm: How Economic Desperation Creates Addiction Epidemics. To understand how an entire city became addicted to gin, you need to understand that this didn't happen by accident. It wasn't a moral panic or cultural degradation. It was the inevitable result of specific economic and social conditions colliding at exactly the wrong moment. Let me walk you through the anatomy of how societies create their own addiction crises. The economic collapse that started everything. London in 1720 wasn't just poor. It was experiencing what we now call a perfect economic storm. The population had exploded, flooding the city with more people than it had housing, jobs, or infrastructure to support. Imagine arriving in a city desperate for work, only to find that 10 other people are already competing for every position. Wages plummeted while rent skyrocketed. The basic math of survival stopped working. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. When people can't meet their basic needs through legitimate work, they don't just accept starvation quietly. They find alternatives. The human brain is remarkably good at finding solutions to immediate problems, even when those solutions create long-term disasters. This is a pattern we see repeated throughout history. Economic desperation doesn't make people give up. It makes them creative, and that creativity often leads to self-destruction. Why water was literally poison. Now layer on top of economic desperation a public health crisis that sounds almost medieval to modern ears. The water in London was genuinely dangerous, not sort of risky or occasionally problematic, actually lethal. The Thames River was an open sewer. Wells were contaminated. The concept of water treatment didn't exist. Drinking water was genuinely more likely to kill you than many alternatives. This created a psychological trap that's crucial to understand. When your options are poisoned water that will definitely make you sick, expensive milk that you can't afford, or cheap gin that makes you feel better temporarily, what choice do you make? From a pure survival standpoint, gin was actually the rational choice. It was sterile because of the alcohol content. It was affordable, and it dulled the pain of your circumstances while you consumed it. This is the first major lesson about addiction epidemics. They don't happen because people are stupid or weak. They happen when people are making the best choice available from a menu of terrible options. Understanding this is crucial because it changes how we think about addressing addiction at a societal level. The government policy that backfired catastrophically. Here's where human incompetence enters the picture. The British government, trying to support domestic grain production and hurt French brandy imports, made gin production incredibly cheap and easy. Anyone could distill gin. There were almost no regulations. The barriers to entry were practically zero. This is economic policy, meeting unintended consequences in the most spectacular way possible. The government thought they were supporting agriculture and patriotism. What they actually did was flood the market with an extremely cheap, highly addictive substance at exactly the moment when the population was most desperate and vulnerable. It's like handing out free opioids in a town where everyone just lost their jobs and health care. The outcome was predictable in retrospect, but nobody saw it coming at the time. The psychology of cheap and available. There's a crucial psychological principle at work here that applies to every addiction crisis. Accessibility matters more than almost any other factor. When something addictive is expensive and hard to get, addiction rates stay relatively low because the friction of obtaining it provides natural breaks in the cycle. But when something is cheap and everywhere, those natural breaks disappear. Gin in 1720s London cost almost nothing. A penny could get you drunk. For context, that was less than the cost of bread. You could get intoxicated for less than it cost to eat a meal. The shops were everywhere, often one per every few houses in poor neighborhoods. There was no waiting, no friction, no natural pause to reconsider. This is the environmental design of addiction, and it's something we see repeated with every major addiction crisis throughout history. The social contagion effect. But addiction doesn't spread purely through individual choices. It spreads through social networks like a contagion. When your neighbors are drinking, when your coworkers start their day with gin, when the social fabric of your community revolves around gin shops, abstaining becomes its own form of social isolation. Humans are fundamentally social creatures. We calibrate our behavior based on what we see others doing. This created a reinforcing cycle that's absolutely crucial to understanding mass addiction. The more people who drank, the more normal drinking became. The more normal drinking became, the more people drank. Social norms shifted dramatically and quickly. Within a generation, what had been occasional consumption became constant intoxication. This wasn't a slow slide. It was a rapid transformation of an entire culture. The economic incentives that made it worse. And then there's the money. Gin production became a massive industry practically overnight. Thousands of people's livelihoods depended on it. Shopkeepers, distillers, suppliers, everyone in the supply chain had a financial incentive to keep gin flowing. This created powerful economic resistance to any attempt at reform. This is another pattern we see in modern addiction crises. Once an industry forms around an addictive substance, that industry fights tooth and nail against any regulation or reduction in consumption. They're not evil. They're not trying to destroy society. They're just responding to economic incentives. But the net effect is that stopping an addiction epidemic becomes exponentially harder once the economic infrastructure is in place. Why individual willpower fails at scale. Here's maybe the most important psychological insight from the gin epidemic. Individual willpower is meaningless in the face of systematic environmental design for addiction. You can be the strongest-willed person in the world, but if you're surrounded by cheap gin, social pressure to drink, economic desperation that makes sobriety painful, and literally poisonous alternatives, you're probably going to drink. This isn't about moral weakness. It's about understanding that humans make decisions within environmental contexts. Change the context dramatically enough, and you change behavior dramatically. The gin epidemic proved that you can take a normal population and turn the majority of them into addicts simply by changing their environment. Not because they're weak, but because humans respond to incentives and conditions. The tipping point. By 1730, London had reached a crisis point that's hard to overstate. Mortality rates were through the roof. The birth rate had collapsed because intoxicated mothers couldn't care for infants. Crime was epidemic. Productivity had plummeted. The city was, quite literally, drinking itself to death. This is what happens when an addiction epidemic goes unchecked. It doesn't just hurt individuals. It threatens the basic functioning of society. London was facing what we now call a civilizational threat, and the question facing them was the same question facing us in every modern addiction crisis. How do you reverse a cycle that has momentum, economic incentives, and social normalization all working in its favor? Part 2. The anatomy of collective denial, when society refuses to see the problem. One of the most fascinating and disturbing aspects of the gin epidemic was how long it took society to recognize it as a crisis. Not because the evidence wasn't there, it was everywhere, but because of complex psychological mechanisms that made people unable or unwilling to see what was right in front of them. This pattern of collective denial is something we see in every major societal crisis, and understanding it is crucial. The normalization of the abnormal. There's a psychological principle called the shifting baseline syndrome. Essentially, each generation accepts as normal the conditions they grew up with, even if those conditions would have been considered catastrophic by the previous generation. This is exactly what happened with gin. People who grew up seeing their neighbors drunk didn't see drunkenness as abnormal. It was just how life was. The gradual slide into mass intoxication happened slowly enough that each small step seemed insignificant. This is how societies lose their frame of reference for normal. You don't wake up one day in a dystopia. You wake up in something slightly worse than yesterday, and you adjust, and you keep adjusting until you're living in conditions that would have shocked you a decade earlier. The economic incentive to deny. But normalization wasn't the only factor. There were powerful economic interests in denying the crisis. Gin production employed thousands. Gin sales generated tax revenue. For the government and business class, acknowledging the full scope of the crisis meant acknowledging that they had created and profited from a catastrophe. This is cognitively almost impossible for most people. There's a psychological defense mechanism called moral disengagement. It allows people to do harm without feeling like bad people by creating cognitive distance between their actions and the consequences. The gin merchants weren't evil. They genuinely believed they were providing a valuable service, offering comfort and relief to desperate people. The government officials convincing themselves that the tax revenue was necessary for national defense. Everyone found ways to justify their role in the system. The blame game. Instead of acknowledging systematic problems, society engaged in massive scapegoating. It was the fault of the poor for lacking moral character. It was the fault of women for being weak. It was the fault of foreign influences corrupting good English values. This pattern of blaming individuals for systematic failures is universal in addiction crises. Why do societies do this? Because blaming individuals is psychologically easier than acknowledging systematic problems. If the crisis is caused by moral weakness, the solution is simple. People just need to try harder, be better, show more willpower. But if the crisis is caused by economic desperation, government policy failure, and environmental design for addiction, that's terrifying. It means the problem is much bigger than any individual can solve. It means the system itself is broken. The role of moral panic. Interestingly, when society did start acknowledging the gin crisis, it often took the form of moral panic rather than practical problem solving. Preachers railed against sin and degradation. Artists like William Hogarth created propaganda depicting gin drinkers as moral monsters. The focus was on judgment and condemnation rather than understanding and solution. This is another universal pattern. Moral panic feels productive. It feels like you're doing something about the problem, but it's actually counterproductive because it creates stigma, which drives addiction underground and makes people less likely to seek help. The gin epidemic shows us that moral condemnation of addiction doesn't reduce addiction. It just makes it more shameful and hidden. The class dynamics of denial. Here's where it gets really interesting from a social psychology perspective. The wealthy in London drank just as much as the poor. The difference was that wealthy people drank imported spirits in private homes, while poor people drank domestic gin in public shops. This created a cognitive divide. The upper classes could tell themselves that they didn't have a drinking problem because they weren't those people in the gin lanes. They had refined taste, expensive spirits, controlled environments. But functionally, many of them were just as addicted. This is the psychology of exceptionalism at work. We humans are extraordinarily good at creating categories that place us outside of problems we're actually experiencing. The failure of early interventions. When the government did finally try to address the crisis, their first attempts were laughably inadequate because they were based on denial of the crisis's true scope. They passed licensing laws that were easy to circumvent. They imposed taxes that were easy to avoid. They created penalties that were impossible to enforce. Why? Because actually addressing the problem would have required admitting how catastrophic it was. It would have required fundamental economic reform, massive social support systems, and a complete restructuring of urban life. That was unthinkable. So instead, they passed laws that looked like action but were designed not to work, allowing everyone to feel like they were doing something while changing nothing. The medical establishment's complicity. Perhaps most disturbing was the medical establishment's role in the denial. Doctors prescribed gin for everything. They recommended it for children. They treated it as medicine while watching their patients develop obvious addiction. This wasn't ignorance. The effects of chronic alcohol consumption were well understood. This was a systematic failure to connect knowledge to action. Why did educated professionals participate in denial? Partly because they were embedded in the same economic system. Partly because acknowledging the crisis would have meant acknowledging their own role in it. But mostly because humans are remarkably good at believing what it's convenient to believe. When all your colleagues are prescribing gin, when respected medical texts recommend it, when your own patients report feeling better after drinking it, it's easy to tell yourself the individual cases of addiction are exceptions. The turning point in awareness. The denial couldn't last forever. Eventually, the crisis became too severe to ignore. Death rates that couldn't be explained away. Child mortality that shocked even hardened observers. Economic productivity so impaired that it threatened national security. At a certain point, denial collapses under the weight of evidence. But here's the crucial lesson. That collapse didn't happen because of better arguments or more dramatic warnings. It happened because the crisis finally impacted people who had power to make changes. When the children of the wealthy started dying. When business profits declined enough to matter. When the crisis crossed class boundaries in ways that couldn't be ignored. That's when denial broke. This teaches us something important about social change. Evidence alone doesn't overcome denial. Evidence has to be combined with stakes. People have to be personally affected in ways they can't avoid before they're willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. It's not a comforting lesson, but it's a consistent one throughout history. Part 3. The government's catastrophic mistakes. How prohibition makes everything worse. When the government finally did try to address the gin epidemic seriously, they made almost every mistake possible. The story of the Gin Acts is a masterclass in how well-intentioned policy can backfire spectacularly when it doesn't understand human psychology and economic reality. These lessons are directly applicable to modern drug policy, making this section particularly relevant. The Gin Act of 1736, good intentions, terrible execution. The first serious attempt to control gin came in 1736 with a law that seemed straightforward. Require expensive licenses to sell gin, impose heavy taxes on production, and crack down on unlicensed sellers. The theory was simple. Make gin more expensive and harder to get, and people will drink less. In practice, this was a disaster of historic proportions. Why? because the law completely failed to understand several crucial factors. First, it didn't address why people were drinking. Economic desperation hadn't changed. Water was still poisonous. Life was still unbearable for most people. All the law did was make the one source of relief more expensive without providing any alternatives. This is prohibition psychology at its most fundamental. You can't eliminate demand by restricting supply if the demand is driven by genuine need. The black market explosion. Predictably, the gin trade went underground immediately. But here's what makes this interesting from a social science perspective. The black market that emerged was more dangerous than the legal market it replaced. Underground distillers cut corners. Quality control disappeared. Gin got adulterated with genuinely toxic substances to increase volume and potency. Deaths from poisoning skyrocketed. This is the iron law of prohibition. When you criminalize a substance people desperately want, you don't eliminate it. You just transfer the market from regulated producers to unregulated criminals. And unregulated criminals have no incentive to maintain quality or safety. They have every incentive to maximize profit, which means cutting costs in ways that hurt consumers. The informant system and social breakdown. The government tried to enforce the Gin Act through an informant system. Citizens were encouraged to report illegal gin sellers, with financial rewards for successful prosecutions. This policy was catastrophic for social cohesion. It turned neighbor against neighbor. It created an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust. It broke down the community bonds that were one of the few things helping people survive. Think about the psychology of this. In neighborhoods where everyone was desperately poor, where community support was essential for survival, the government created incentives to betray your neighbors. This didn't just fail to stop gin consumption. It destroyed the social fabric that might have helped people support each other in finding alternatives to drinking. The riots and resistance. The response from the population was immediate and violent. The gin riots of the 1730s and 1740s were some of the most significant civil disturbances in London's history. These weren't mindless chaos. They were political protests against laws that people correctly perceived as unjust and unworkable. Here's the social psychology lesson. When people believe a law is fundamentally unfair, when they see it as targeting the poor while the rich continue their own drinking without consequence, they don't obey. They resist, and their resistance isn't irrational. It's a form of collective action against perceived injustice. The government learned that you can't enforce laws that the majority of the population believes are wrong, at least not without levels of violence that themselves threaten social stability. The compliance failure. The enforcement statistics tell a remarkable story. Tens of thousands of people were prosecuted under the Gin Acts, fines were levied, goods were seized, people were imprisoned, and gin consumption barely declined at all. In fact, in some periods it actually increased. This is what happens when policy fights against economic and social reality instead of working with it. The failure wasn't about insufficient enforcement. It was about the fundamental impossibility of the task. You cannot enforce a law that requires monitoring every private home and every personal transaction in a city of hundreds of thousands of people. You cannot punish enough people to create deterrence when the majority of the population is breaking the law. At a certain scale, prohibition becomes unenforceable not because of lack of will, but because of mathematical impossibility. The class hypocrisy. One of the most corrosive aspects of the Gin Acts was their obvious class bias. The wealthy continued drinking their imported spirits without interference. The laws specifically targeted cheap gin consumed by the poor. This wasn't accidental. The laws were written by the wealthy to control the poor, but this hypocrisy destroyed any moral authority the laws might have had. When people see that laws apply to them but not to the powerful, they don't conclude that they should follow the laws more carefully. They conclude that the laws are unjust and the system is rigged. This perception isn't wrong. The gin laws were explicitly class-based, And this explicit bias ensured their failure because it prevented any possibility of widespread voluntary compliance. The economic devastation. The Gin Acts didn't just fail to reduce drinking, they caused significant economic harm. Legitimate businesses were destroyed, jobs were lost, tax revenue plummeted as the market went underground. The government lost money while simultaneously creating a massive new criminal industry. This is the economic irony of prohibition. Trying to suppress an industry through law often costs more than the industry cost in the first place. The gradual realization. It took decades, but eventually policymakers realized the Gin Acts weren't working. This realization didn't come from moral enlightenment. It came from practical failure. The laws were unenforceable. The population wouldn't comply. The economic costs were unsustainable. Reality eventually forces itself on even the most stubborn ideology. The lesson of alternative approaches. What finally started to work wasn't stricter prohibition. It was a combination of factors: economic improvements that gave people alternatives to gin, gradual public health improvements that made water safer, and critically, laws that regulated rather than banned gin production. When the government finally accepted that they couldn't eliminate gin, they started asking how to make gin consumption less destructive. That shift in thinking, from elimination to harm reduction, was the beginning of actual progress. This is the most important lesson for modern policy. Prohibition doesn't work when it fights against genuine social need. Regulation, harm reduction, and addressing root causes work better than criminalization. It's not a satisfying lesson for people who want simple solutions, but it's a consistent one throughout history. Part 4. The social structures that emerged: community and chaos. One of the most fascinating aspects of the gin epidemic is how communities adapted to constant intoxication. Far from descending into pure chaos, Gin Lane developed its own social structures, support systems, and internal logic. Understanding these adaptations gives us insight into how humans create order even in the most disordered circumstances. The underground economy. With the formal economy in shambles and prohibition creating black markets, an entire underground economy emerged around gin. This wasn't just criminal activity. It was a complex system of exchange, credit, and mutual support that functioned outside legal channels, but with its own internal rules and enforcement mechanisms. Gin shops became informal banks, extending credit to regular customers. Neighbors bartered goods and services in exchange for drinks or the use of distilling equipment. Children ran errands and made deliveries for a share of profits. What looked like chaos from the outside was actually a functioning economy, just one operating on different rules than the legitimate market. This teaches us something important about human social organization. When formal institutions fail, people don't just accept failure. They create informal institutions to meet their needs. These informal institutions may be illegal. They may be inefficient, but they arise because humans fundamentally need systems of exchange and cooperation to survive. The mutual aid networks. Despite constant intoxication, communities on Gin Lane developed sophisticated mutual aid networks. When someone collapsed from drinking, neighbors dragged them home. When a house caught fire from an overturned candle, the community formed bucket brigades. When someone died, the community pooled resources for burial. These weren't organized charities or formal institutions. They were organic responses to shared vulnerability. Everyone knew they might be the next person who needed help. This created a form of insurance based on reciprocity. You helped your neighbor today because you'd need your neighbor's help tomorrow. The gin epidemic didn't destroy this mutual aid, it made it more essential. The role of women as community managers. Women played a crucial but often invisible role in maintaining whatever social order existed in gin-soaked neighborhoods. They managed scarce resources. They cared for children of mothers too intoxicated to function. They maintained networks of information and support. They negotiated with landlords and shopkeepers to keep households afloat. The figure of the Jinn widow, a woman whose partner was lost to addiction, was common. But these women weren't just victims. Many became the actual heads of households and communities, taking on roles that formal society them. The crisis created space for women to exercise power and agency in ways the formal social structure prohibited. This is an example of how crises can sometimes shift gender dynamics, though at tremendous cost. The community of the Jinn shop. Jinn shops were more than businesses. They were social institutions that served multiple functions. They were meeting places, news exchanges, informal courts where disputes were settled, and sources of entertainment. For people living in crowded, miserable conditions, the Jinn shop was the closest thing to public space available. This is an important insight about addiction and place. People weren't just drinking for the alcohol. They were drinking for the community, for the temporary escape from isolation, for the social interaction. This means that addressing addiction can't just be about removing the substance. It has to be about providing alternative sources of community and connection. When gin shops were closed during Prohibition, people didn't stop drinking. They just lost the one form of social connection available to them, making the isolation and misery worse. The culture of children in crisis. Children growing up during the gin epidemic developed their own adaptive culture. They formed gangs for mutual protection and resource sharing. They developed sophisticated street skills for survival. They created games and entertainment from scraps. They took on adult responsibilities at young ages, caring for younger siblings and contributing to household economies. This wasn't healthy childhood development, but it was adaptation. Children who grew up in these conditions learned resilience, street smarts, and mutual reliance. Some of these skills served them well in later life, but many also carried trauma that shaped them for decades. This is the complex legacy of childhood during crisis, adaptation that is both survival and scar. The informal justice system. With formal law enforcement overwhelmed and often corrupt, communities developed informal justice systems. Theft from neighbors was punished by social ostracism or community-imposed penalties. Disputes were mediated by respected elders or shopkeepers. Violence had limits enforced by the community, not by law. This informal justice was imperfect and sometimes brutal, but it filled a void left by formal institutions. It teaches us that humans need systems of justice and order. When formal systems fail, informal ones emerge. Understanding this is crucial because it means that improving communities can't just be about imposing external order. It has to work with the informal systems communities create for themselves. The social hierarchies. Even in the seeming equality of shared poverty and addiction, social hierarchies emerged. Long-term residents had status over newcomers. Skilled workers had status over the unskilled. Those who managed to maintain some sobriety had status over those who didn't. These hierarchies weren't based on wealth. Almost no one had wealth, but on competence, connections, and contribution to community survival. Understanding these hierarchies matters because it shows that humans create status systems even in the most leveled circumstances. This drive for hierarchy and differentiation is fundamental to human psychology. Any intervention that doesn't account for it is likely to fail. The religious communities. Churches and religious groups tried to provide alternative community structures to the gin shops. Some of these efforts were patronizing and ineffective, moral lectures to people who needed practical help. But some churches provided real services: food, shelter, education for children, advocacy with authorities. These became competing sources of community and support. The most effective religious interventions weren't the ones that condemned gin drinkers as sinners. They were the ones that treated them as people in crisis who needed help. This is a pattern we see across addiction intervention. Judgment doesn't help. practical support, and unconditional community do. The art and culture of crisis. Remarkably, even in the depths of the crisis, art and culture flourished. Street ballads about gin, satirical prints, songs, and stories were created, shared, and refined. This wasn't high art by establishment standards, but it was genuine creative expression. It was how people made sense of their circumstances, created shared meaning, and maintained humanity in dehumanizing conditions. This cultural production is significant because it shows that humans need meaning-making even in, especially in, crisis. The gin ballads weren't just entertainment. They were commentary, criticism, and coping mechanism. They turned tragedy into dark comedy, suffering into satire. This creative response to crisis is universal across human cultures and times. Part 5. The Path to Recovery: How Societies Heal from Mass Addiction. The gin epidemic didn't end overnight. There was no magical solution, no single policy change that fixed everything. Instead, recovery was a gradual process driven by multiple factors working together over decades. Understanding this recovery process gives us crucial insights into how societies can address addiction crises. The economic shifts that mattered. The first factor in recovery was economic. Gradually, very gradually, economic conditions in London improved. Wages rose. Employment became more stable. The basic math of survival started working again for more people. This didn't happen because of any single policy. It happened because of broader economic trends: industrialization creating new jobs, colonial trade generating wealth, agricultural improvements making food more available. Why does this matter? Because it demonstrates that addiction epidemics can't be solved through addiction-focused policies alone. They have to be addressed through economic improvement. When people have genuine economic alternatives to constant intoxication, when they can meet their basic needs through work, when they have hope for improvement, they have reasons to reduce consumption. This is the fundamental lesson that every modern addiction crisis forgets. You can't treat addiction without treating the economic desperation that drives it. The water revolution. Public health improvements, particularly in water quality, were crucial. When London finally started developing cleaner water sources, when wells were improved and water distribution became safer, people had an alternative to gin for hydration. This sounds obvious, but it was revolutionary. For the first time in generations, drinking water didn't mean risking death. The lesson here is about alternatives. You can't just take away a coping mechanism. You have to provide a better alternative. As long as gin was the safest liquid to drink, people would drink gin. Once water became safe, gin consumption began to decline. This applies to every addiction. You need to provide better options, not just remove the current option. The regulatory approach that finally worked. When the government finally moved away from prohibition toward regulation, progress accelerated. Instead of trying to ban gin, the government focused on quality control, limiting the most dangerous production methods, controlling where gin could be sold, and taxing it reasonably rather than punitively. This approach wasn't perfect, but it was sustainable and effective. The key difference was pragmatism over idealism. The government accepted that people would continue drinking. The question became how to make drinking less destructive rather than how to stop drinking entirely. This harm reduction approach worked where prohibition had failed. It's a lesson that applies directly to modern drug policy, but that we seem to keep relearning at tremendous cost. The generational chain. Perhaps most importantly, recovery required generational change. The generation that grew up during the height of the gin epidemic many never fully recovered. But the next generation, growing up in improving economic conditions with better public health and more effective regulation, had different experiences and made different choices. This is a sobering lesson about addiction recovery at the societal level. Sometimes you can't save the current generation. The best you can do is create conditions where the next generation has better options. This doesn't mean giving up on people currently struggling. It means understanding that societal recovery is measured in generations, not years. The cultural shift. Gradually, cultural attitudes toward gin changed. It went from being normalized and universal to being associated with the lowest classes and most desperate circumstances. This cultural shift both reflected and drove declining consumption. As gin became stigmatized, its use declined. But this stigmatization only worked because economic alternatives existed. Stigma alone, without better options, just creates shame without reducing consumption. The role of alternative institutions. As economic conditions improved, alternative social institutions developed. Coffee houses offered social spaces without the focus on intoxication. Tea became fashionable and accessible. New forms of entertainment emerged. Parks and public spaces improved. These alternatives gave people places to go and things to do besides drinking. This multiplicity of alternatives is crucial. You can't replace a gin shop which served multiple social functions with a single alternative. You need a whole ecosystem of options, places to socialize, sources of community, forms of entertainment, ways to find meaning and connection. Building this ecosystem takes time and investment, but it's essential for sustainable recovery. The medical understanding. Medical understanding of addiction improved, slowly and imperfectly. Doctors began treating alcohol dependence as a condition requiring care rather than a moral failing requiring condemnation. This didn't lead to miraculous cures. Effective addiction treatment wouldn't emerge for centuries, but it did reduce stigma and create space for people to seek help. The shift from moral model to medical model of addiction was crucial. It allowed people to admit they had problems without admitting they were fundamentally flawed as human beings. This created the possibility of recovery, which the moral model had foreclosed. The incomplete recovery. But we need to be honest about recovery. London never completely returned to pre-gin patterns of alcohol consumption. Some level of elevated drinking persisted. Some neighborhoods and families never fully recovered. The scars of the epidemic lasted for generations. This is important to understand because it tempers expectations. Recovery doesn't mean return to a perfect state. It means improvement, reduction of harm, creation of better conditions for the next generation. The legacy and lessons. The gin epidemic left lasting marks on London. It changed laws, social policy, urban planning, and cultural attitudes toward alcohol. It demonstrated that addiction is a social problem, not just an individual one. It showed that prohibition doesn't work, but that doesn't mean doing nothing. It revealed that economic desperation drives addiction, and that you can't solve addiction without addressing economic desperation. These lessons have been proven repeatedly by every addiction crisis since then. Yet we keep learning them anew at terrible cost. The opioid epidemic in modern America shows the same patterns: economic desperation, pharmaceutical industry incentives, ineffective prohibition, black markets more dangerous than legal ones, moral panic instead of practical solutions, stigma that prevents help seeking. What modern societies can learn. If there's one central lesson from the gin epidemic, it's this: addiction epidemics are symptoms of social dysfunction, not causes. Gin didn't destroy London. The economic and social conditions that drove people to gin had already devastated the city. Gin just made the devastation visible and accelerated it. This means that addressing addiction requires addressing root causes: economic security, social connection, hope for the future, alternatives to despair. These are massive undertakings. They're much harder than simply blaming individuals or passing laws against drugs, but they're what actually works. Modern addiction crises, whether opioids, social media, gambling, or anything else, follow the same patterns. Understanding the gin epidemic gives us a framework for understanding our own crises. Economic desperation creates vulnerability. Cheap, accessible, addictive substances exploit that vulnerability. Social isolation drives people toward any source of connection, even destructive ones. Prohibition without alternatives fails. Moral judgment without support fails. Only comprehensive approaches addressing economic, social, medical, and regulatory factors together make progress. The hope in the history. But there is hope in this history. London recovered. It took decades. The recovery was imperfect. But the city that had been literally drinking itself to death in 1730 was thriving by 1800. Addiction epidemics are not permanent. Societies can recover, but only if they're willing to address root causes, not just symptoms. Only if they're willing to try things that work rather than things that feel satisfying. Only if they're willing to measure success in generations rather than election cycles. The people of gin-soaked London couldn't imagine recovery. The crisis seemed permanent, insurmountable, but gradual changes accumulated. Economic conditions improved, water quality improved, social institutions rebuilt, culture shifted, and eventually the gin epidemic became history rather than present. We face our own epidemics now. The specific substances change, but the patterns remain. Understanding those patterns, really understanding them through historical case studies like the gin epidemic, gives us the knowledge we need to respond effectively. Not with easy answers or moral panics, but with comprehensive, compassionate, evidence-based approaches that address human needs rather than punishing human weaknesses. The gin epidemic is a story of human vulnerability and resilience, of social collapse and gradual recovery, of policy failure and eventual pragmatism. It's a story that matters because we're living variations of it right now. And the lesson is clear. We can do better. We can learn from history. We can respond to addiction with compassion and intelligence instead of judgment and prohibition. We can create conditions where people have better options than slow poison. That's the real message of the gin epidemic. Not that people are weak or society is doomed, but that when we create desperate conditions, people make desperate choices. And when we create better conditions, people make better choices. It's not mysterious. It's not about morality. It's about understanding human behavior and responding with wisdom rather than ideology. Closing reflection. As we close this deep dive into the gin epidemic, consider what modern crises this illuminates for you. Are we in the middle of our own gin epidemic? What patterns do you see repeating? What lessons have we failed to learn? The people of 1720s London couldn't step outside their crisis to see it clearly. They were too embedded in it, too overwhelmed by it. But we have the gift of historical perspective. We can see their mistakes, their blind spots, their gradual path to recovery. And that gives us the opportunity to see our own crises more clearly, to avoid their mistakes, to find our own paths to recovery faster and with less suffering. That's why history matters. Not because the past repeats exactly, but because human patterns repeat. Understanding those patterns gives us power to shape our future differently. If you found this deep dive valuable, subscribe for more explorations of how history illuminates modern crises. Like if you learned something that changed how you think about addiction or social policy. And comment with your thoughts. What modern crisis most resembles the gin epidemic, and what lessons should we be applying? Remember, the gin epidemic seemed permanent and unsurvivable while it was happening, but it wasn't. Societies can heal. We can heal, but only if we're willing to learn from history and respond with wisdom. Thanks for spending this time with me exploring one of history's most catastrophic and instructive crises. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep learning from the past to build a better future.